I tell you a true crime story and we drink. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you choose to enjoy one of our themed margaritas, please ensure that you are of legal drinking age and have fun but drink responsibly. For today's crime, we head to the Aloha State, the last state admitted to the Union. The only island state of Hawaii is a land of lush greenery, beautiful flowers, surfing on crystal blue waters. And in the late night hours of January 2nd, 1932, it was the site of a vicious, completely unjustifiable murder. Today's crime is a crime of imagined honor, revenge misplaced, and racism inherent in our criminal justice system from nearly a century ago. It was a crime that gripped the nation and seemed to put America's very pillars of justice and equality on trial. I think we're gonna need a strong drink. I've never been to Hawaii, but trust me, I've always wanted to go. Today we're making a margarita that's reminiscent of the island state. We're gonna start with 1 part mango nectar. And to keep the tropical explosion going, we're gonna add 1 part pineapple nectar. Secondly, some triple sec. 1 part. 1 part simple syrup. And 1 part lime juice. To that, we're going to add 2 parts tequila. Shake it up. What do we do, bougie people? We strain over fresh ice in a salt-rimmed glass, obviously. All right, no more delaying the inevitable. Let's begin. I think it's important that as we begin today's episode, we talk a little bit about the history of Hawaii. It's going to help put into context what happens in this crime. The Hawaiian Islands were settled initially by Polynesians as early as 400 CE, using only the stars in the night sky to guide them. Initially, the islands were ruled by separate chieftains. The people of the islands were nearly rendered extinct with the arrival of foreign diseases that they had not been exposed to, similarly to North American indigenous tribes. John Cook, we're not going to talk about in this story, is an interesting European in all of this situation. Fun fact, he was actually killed after he tried to attack a Hawaiian king. So there you go. Between 1791 and 1810, King Kamehameha united the Hawaiian Islands underneath him as the one king. The Kingdom of Hawaii was an internationally recognized monarchy. It was a sovereign nation that entered into bilateral treaties of trade with countries across the world, including the United States. Sugar had been a major export from the Hawaiian Islands since the 18th century, and the first permanent sugar plantation was built on the islands in 1835. Hawaii had had a friendly trading relationship with the United States since 1826, but all of that sort of started to change. The U.S. government, encouraged by Theodore Roosevelt, who at that time was the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, really saw Hawaii as quite an important military area. Annexing Hawaii was crucial for the United States' imperialistic philosophy. It was perfectly positioned in the center of the Pacific Ocean and would provide a strategic stronghold as the United States continued to do what they liked doing the most, taking over other countries. But this time, they had their eyes set on the Eastern Hemisphere. The overthrow of the Hawaiian government began officially in 1893. Lawrence Thurston, the Hawaiian Minister of the Interior and grandson of American missionaries, designed and implemented the overthrow of the then queen. Her name was Queen Liliuokalani. She was captured and placed in a small room on the second floor of her palace under house arrest. She ordered her forces to surrender, and at gunpoint, she abdicated her throne in order to avoid bloodshed. To the people of Hawaii, she was still queen. Thurston was declared president of the new Republic of Hawaii, which lasted just about long enough for the United States Congress to draw up those annexation papers. Congress passed that legislation in 1898, having consulted not a single Hawaiian person. Naturally. The United States established themselves as the governing body of Hawaii without allowing a single indigenous Hawaiian a say or a vote. Doesn't seem very democratic to me. Hawaiian protests started immediately following the annexation, and many Hawaiian people called it an act of war. Following the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom, in 1899, a naval base was established in Hawaii. The station would be known as Naval Station Pearl Harbor. Thalia Massie was as aristocratic as Americans come. Her great-grandfather was the first president of the National Geographic Society. Her grandfather on her mother's side, Charles Bell, was first cousins with inventor Alexander Graham Bell. Her grandfather on her father's side, Robert Roosevelt, was Theodore Roosevelt's uncle. She was Theodore Roosevelt's second cousin. When she was born in February of 1911 to parents Grace and Raleigh Fortescue, it was inevitable that she would be raised among the upper echelon of American society. Seems almost inevitable that she would grow up a mischief maker. She once stole an idling baker's truck and drove it around the corner, and she once pushed off a baby carriage, terrifying the mother who did not know where her child had gone. She married a U.S. naval officer, Lieutenant Thomas Massie, who went by Tommy, when she was 16 years old. It seems like she had romanticized what life as a Navy wife would be, and when it didn't turn out to be all the glamorous travel that she had envisioned, she started shirking the Navy wife duties that she was supposed to be doing. She left parties early, she engaged in heavy drinking, and she had some pretty public fights with Tommy. Tommy became fed up with his wife, and he threatened to send her home if she didn't comply with a set of basically conditions that he wrote up in order to remain in the marriage. She suffered 2 miscarriages during this time, which really exacerbated her mental health struggles and continued to make her act in an inappropriate way, at least in the eyes of Navy society. On September 12th, 1931, the Massies and several of their other Navy couple friends went to a local Waikiki nightclub called the Ala Inn. At about 11:30 p.m., Thalia had a fight with another Navy lieutenant, and after she slapped him, she left the building and then was headed to another dancing club. Tommy hadn't seen what had happened, and he stayed at the club until it closed, assuming that Thalia had gone home because she was tired. Sometime between 12:20 and 12:45 a.m., Thalia was picked up in a car by a few friends. She said at that time that she had been assaulted and robbed by several Hawaiian men. She didn't want police involved. She just wanted to go home. So that's what her friends did. They drove her home, and Tommy hadn't arrived back yet, and Thalia didn't have keys, so she broke in through the back door to go inside. Tommy, meanwhile, heads to an after party at a friend's house, but when he arrives, he realizes there actually isn't an after party, and finally decides that at about 1 a.m. is a good time to call his wife. He calls several times before she answers, and then she tells him to come home immediately, that something is really wrong. After Tommy arrived home, despite Thalia's objections, he called the police. When they arrived at the Massie's home, they took her initial statement. She said it was too dark to identify anything about her assailants or any details about the car that they were driving. The first officer to arrive at the scene had this to say about Thalia. quote, "The only thing I noticed about Mrs. Massie's face was the busted lip, her hair was all messed up, and she was crying." End quote. Another officer remembered that she was able to speak clearly, and she didn't say anything about a hurting jaw. Well, that statement changed pretty drastically. Several hours later, she was not only able to somehow identify almost every digit of a license plate, but suddenly then she had also been raped and punched in the face. She also was describing her attackers as locals. Within 12 hours, the police had rounded up 12 suspects from working class neighborhoods on the island. The young men would come to be known as the Ala Moana Boys. Joseph Kahahawai was a 20-year-old Hawaiian native who was the leader of an informal group of guys known as the School Street Gang. Ben Ahaquelo was also a 20-year-old native Hawaiian who had made sort of a name for himself as a football star and a boxer. Horace Ida was a 24-year-old man of Chinese descent. His real name was Shomatsu, but his friends called him Shorty. Henry Chang was a 22-year-old who was part native Hawaiian and part Chinese. And David Takai, whose nickname was Mac, was a 21-year-old of Japanese descent. The 5 young men were arrested and charged with rape and assault. What did all these guys have in common? Well, they weren't white, and the press absolutely vilified and demonized them. One of the boys was called a convicted burglar, even though he'd never been convicted of burglary. One of the young men was deemed by the press as a convicted rapist, even though he had never been either convicted nor charged with rape. Simultaneously, Thalia was deemed a white woman of refinement and culture by at least one local newspaper. Before the trial even began, the rumor mill ramped up. The first rumor was that Thalia hadn't been raped at all, but had been in a relationship with one of the Ala Moana boys. Another rumor circulated that Tommy had been the one to beat up Thalia after discovering her in an illicit sexual affair with one of his Navy buddies. Enter into the picture Thalia's mother, Grace Fortescue, who had arrived thundering onto the islands and ready to defend her daughter's honor at a moment's notice. She immediately started a public campaign to smear the defendants. Apparently, that seemed to work with the racist white press. There was a ton of evidence that these guys were actually innocent. And after the 3-week trial and the 90-something hours of deliberation, the jury, or at least some members of the jury, couldn't buy Thalia's ever-changing story, as well as taking into account some of that other evidence. They declared themselves deadlocked. 6 voted for conviction and 6 voted for acquittal. It's important to note that across the United States, especially on the mainland, this mistrial was cause for concern. Many mainland Americans clamored for reform in what the press deemed savage Hawaii. But regardless, on December 6, 1931, the Ala Moana boys were set free on the basis of a mistrial. Okay, great. Justice served. End of story, right? Sorry. Drink up. Grace, Thalia's mom, was unwilling to wait for a second trial. She, along with Tommy, began a plot to kidnap the Ala Moana boys and extract a confession. On December 12th, Grace arranged for a group of Tommy's Navy buddies to kidnap Horace. They did so and viciously beat him with belt buckles. He only survived because he faked going unconscious. On January 8th, Grace, Tommy, and 2 of his army buddies kidnapped Joseph in broad daylight. In the course of beating him, one of the 4 shoots Joseph and kills him with 1 shot through the heart. They rush to figure out a plan, what to do with the body, and decide that they're going to throw him into the ocean at a place called Cocoa Head. It had pretty rough waters and rocky terrain, and they thought that it would tear his body apart and make it difficult to, track them down. On the way there, a police officer actually notices their suspicious vehicle and manages to pull them over, finding the 4 of them in the car and Joseph's body. He arrested them immediately on the charges of kidnapping and murder. It seems as if the whole island came to mourn at Joseph's funeral. Joseph was a pretty popular football player himself and had also served as a member of the Territorial National Guard. He was pretty beloved in Hawaii. In preparation for the trial, over 100 potential jurors were interviewed. After that, the jury was selected, with 7 whites, 3 Chinese, and 2 Hawaiians. Clarence Darrow, a retired defense attorney, came out of retirement to defend the 4, taking a sum of over $30,000 to do so. That's about $500,000 in today's money. He had lost all of his money in the economic crash of the previous decade, so he was willing to take up this defense because he needed the cash. His first major defense was that Tommy was suffering from temporary insanity, but that didn't seem to be resonating well with the jurors, so he made a quick switcheroo. Clarence decided to go for what they call jury nullification. This was his specialty. He was pretty good at it. Jury nullification happens when a jury actually believes that a defendant is guilty, but chooses not to convict anyway because they feel like the law itself is unjust. It was Clarence's assertion that the jury should ignore the law because Tommy needed to defend the honor of his wife. Of course, this entire defense is predicated on an entire sea of lies. Remember, Thalia didn't even see her attackers. Throughout the trial, Thalia portrayed herself as an innocent victim who had been physically harmed and her reputation irreparably damaged. During cross-examination, however, the prosecutor started to play on her feelings of superiority to others on the island. She became enraged, ripping up a piece of evidence on the stand and rushing into her husband's arms. She was Clarence's star witness, and she had cracked. The jury found the 4 guilty of manslaughter, not murder. Thalia's screams could be heard throughout the courthouse as she watched both her mother and her husband be convicted. No one really expected that verdict. Racial tensions were so high during that time that a hung jury is what was expected. And things exploded, especially on the mainland after the verdict was read. Under pressure from the Navy, Territorial Governor Lawrence Judd reduced the sentences of the 4 convicted felons from 10 years to 1 hour, a term to be served in his office. A few days later, all 4 felons, Thalia and the attorney, Clarence, boarded a Navy-chartered ocean liner and set sail for California, where they were received as heroes. Almost immediately, the territorial government of Honolulu hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to investigate the case of the Ala Moana boys and to get to the truth. The team of detectives re-investigated the entire case, and by October of 1932, they produce a 273-page report that they present to Governor Judd. This report says it was impossible for those boys to have attacked Thalia. Also, they raised a lot of questions as to whether or not she'd been attacked at all. On February 13th, 1933, it's announced that all charges will be dropped against the remaining living Ala Moana boys. But they lived under the shadow of that trial for the rest of their lives. Within 2 years, Thalia and Tommy were divorced. She never, for the rest of her life, displayed any remorse or even acknowledged the possibility that she might have been mistaken in who she identified that night. In fact, she called what the Pinkerton detectives came up with a stupid lie. Thalia suffered from mental illness for the rest of her life, and after another failed marriage and many failed suicide attempts, she succeeded in ending her own life with barbiturates in 1963. She was 52 years old. Tommy remarried in 1937, but by 1940, a naval board had determined that he was manic depressive and thereby unfit to continue serving in the military. He lived an embittered civilian life until his death in 1987. Thalia's mother, Grace, managed to make a quick buck off of what had happened in Hawaii by writing about her adventures as a murderer. She then collected the inheritance from her father and lived a life of abundant wealth until her death in 1979 at age 95. Until her dying day, she insisted that killing a man to save her daughter's reputation was totally justified, and she had done nothing wrong. In 1966, while being interviewed by an author, Albert Jones, one of those two Navy buddies of Tommy's, admitted that he had been the one who shot Joseph. I do not want to understate the blatant racism in this case. An admiral of the U.S. Navy stationed in Pearl Harbor had this to say, quote, "Our first inclination is to seize the brutes and string them up on the trees, but we must give the authorities a chance to carry out the law and not interfere." End quote. It's a wonder these guys weren't convicted immediately. A Time magazine article from 1931 stated, quote, "Yellow men's lust for white women had broken bounds." End quote. Sick. And the worst one of all, an editorial run in Hearst newspapers throughout the country had this to say, quote, "The situation in Hawaii is deplorable. It is becoming or has become an unsafe place for white women. Outside the cities or small towns, the roads go through jungles, and in these remote places, bands of degenerate natives or half-castes lie in wait for white women driving by." End quote. The racism towards indigenous Hawaiian Islanders and Asian residents was sick, thick, and criminal. How far we've come, and how far we have yet to go. So what do you think? Do you think we've come far enough in our criminal justice system that if this were to happen again today, a murder like the murder of Joseph, that the 4 criminals would go to jail for actual murder? What about the obscene lessening of the sentence to 1 hour? Could something like that happen today? And why did Thalia lie about who had attacked her and what they had done? And what kind of pathology drives a woman like Grace Fortescue? The caucasity that drove that woman? My God. The effects of this case and trial impact the people of Hawaii even today. It fits within the context of the history of the mainland United States and Hawaii that goes back hundreds of years. And if anything, it just increased the mistrust and downright hatred of the Hawaiian people towards the United States. And can you blame them? In a country that had already basically been stolen by the United States. 5 young men were arrested and put on trial for something they didn't do. And after they were set free, Joseph was kidnapped, viciously beaten, brutalized, and murdered. And according to the territorial government, his life was worth 1 hour of prison time. Not even spent in a prison. What a horrific travesty of justice. For shame. Thanks for hanging out with me. Today's case wasn't chosen based on today's political climate and what's happening with Asian Americans across the United States. But even still, I hope you'll join me in supporting financially an organization that works to stop Asian hate. I'm putting a few of my favorites into the description box. One, which is called Asian Americans Advancing Justice, is a nationwide nonprofit legal advocacy group that works to protect the rights of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders across the United States. I hope you'll consider donating for Joseph. Next week, it's time for another cult, and this one is, well, on fire. So, we're gonna need some Fireball. Fireball whiskey, that is. I'll see you next week, and remember, there are always alternatives to murder.